Paul writes, I have become all things to all men, so that I may by all means save some. 1 Corinthians 9:22b. In modern terms, Paul practiced contextualization. In the current debate about contextualization, there are questions over how far one should go in contextualizing. This paper will briefly examine 1 Corinthians 9:19 through 23, and its relationship with current discussions on contextualization. It will establish that Paul's methodology and message are inextricably intertwined and that his contextualization was limited by his message, namely the gospel. Now, a basic understanding of contextualization is that it is the process of making sure that the gospel is understood by any given audience. David Hesselgrave and Edward Rahman provide three components of the contextualization process: revelation, interpretation, and application. Revelation refers to the truths of God that are revealed in His Word. Interpretation takes into consideration the viewpoint from which the reader or the hearer understands the meaning that was originally intended. The third component of application considers the logical implications of the interpreter's understanding of the biblical text for the culture in which it is to be lived out. It either accepts or rejects those implications. Within discussions on contextualization, one of the ongoing debates is over what is known as the C1 through C6 scale, primarily relating to categories C5 and C6. The C5 category refers to what is basically known as an insider movement, where Christians remain in a Muslim community to lead others to Christ. They are considered Muslims by their communities. C6 are essentially secret believers. Some have used 1 Corinthians 9:19 through 23 to support such contextualization as found in the C5 category. The argument is that as long as one is guided by conscience and the desire to glorify God and that people are saved, this level of contextualization is acceptable. However, the question remains whether or not such contextualization is what Paul is talking about in this passage. The full text of the passage reads, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I may win more. To the Jews I became as a Jew, so that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, so that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that I may by all means save some. I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it." In these verses, Paul uses himself as an example, wherein he provides a view of his methodology. It is important to remember that method and message cannot be separated, that Paul's methodology was driven by his message. Roy Ciampa and Brian Rosner put it this way: these verses help clarify that it is not merely the preaching of the gospel per se that is important, but the preaching of the gospel through a messenger who incarnates its message, such that the hearers can both understand it clearly from one who obviously empathizes with them and can see what it would look like if it took root in them. David Carson outlines three ways that Paul limited the accommodating principle that is espoused by the phrase "all things to all men." First, all the demands made by Christianity are not negotiable. In the context of this passage, Paul lays out that Christians can eat meat that was offered to idols. However, Christians were not to participate in pagan celebrations. As David Garland notes, Paul's accommodation has nothing to do with watering down the gospel message, soft-pedaling its ethical demands, or compromising its absolute monotheism. For Carson, the second limitation was that Paul existed in a third ground between the Jew and the Gentile, wherein though he is free from any necessary submission to Torah, he does not have the freedom to pass beyond certain bounds, for example, the teachings and life of Christ. The third limitation that Paul places on himself in this verse is in how it is expressed. First, it's limited by race, as the main designation being made in this verse is between Jew and Gentile. The second limitation expressed in the verse is that of the purpose behind accommodation, the winning of souls. With these three limitations in place, it's important to note that the context of this passage is about Christian ethics. Paul is writing to point out the limitations of Christian liberty, which are in essence based upon the gospel. Dean Fleming writes, Paul's ongoing theological and ethical reflection on the gospel enables the eternal word to be fleshed out in particular forms of language and modes of persuasion, and applied to a whole range of pastoral problems. It is this connection between methodology and message that provides the basis for fully understanding what is going on in this passage. The message provides the boundaries for the methodology. Fleming is right in stating that believers must show respect for cultural and ethnic distinctions and erect no unnecessary barriers to the gospel. Dan Mitchell provides a balancing word of caution, though. Paul refuses to mingle godlessness with the things of Christ. By the same token, he will approach the Jew with a keen sensitivity to those matters of religious observance that might cause offense and stand as stumbling blocks to their response to the gospel. But here too he will draw the line where he might compromise the law of Christ. In such cases, he will take his stand and let the chips fall where they may. 1 Corinthians 9:19-23 has been used to support the idea that C5 contextualization is acceptable. However, given the context, purpose, and limitations that are provided within the passage itself, this passage does not provide the stable foundation on which to establish a compelling argument. Indeed, given the idea that the gospel itself, as well as the teachings and example of the life of Christ, provide ethical basis for the Christian life, one cannot securely argue for a compromise of the message for the sake of methodology. The message shapes the method. In this sense, Paul practiced critical contextualization, which provides a culturally relevant understanding of the gospel while also ensuring checks against syncretism, with a high regard for the authority and sufficiency of the Bible. This type of contextualization upholds the distinctives and truths of Christianity while ensuring that the gospel is understandable to any given audience.